All right, so we are back for we're at session 7 already of 8 for the Wisdom Books and Growth Track, Wisdom Literature. My name is Mark Miller, pastor of the Bourbon campus. If you want credit, go to cough.tv or churchheartland.com, go on to Growth Track, select that. It's a fee to take the test. The test is real simple. Did you watch all the classes, and did you read at least 2 wisdom books? Again, I ask you to go through there and read it in the way that we talked about the wisdom literature set up so you can really absorb it. Okay, if we had more time, I would ask about how that was going, but I'm just going to barrel through here. So usually I would recap a little bit about what we've been talking about, but we have 1 hour to finish Proverbs, get through Ecclesiastes and Song of Songs. So we're not recapping. We're going to pick up right where we left off. So we're talking about, we're going to talk about Lady Wisdom in the book of Proverbs, because Proverbs is Bible's wisdom literature. And just to summarize this one sentence, wisdom means being skillful in godly living. It's one thing to be skillful in a trade or something like that, but this is a way to be skillful in living for God externally. Talked about Psalms is that struggle internal. Proverbs is about living external, living for God in the world. When things come out, how do you navigate that and really get wise counsel? And Proverbs are those short, sharp, real clear statements. Basically, that real succinct saying that unpacks a lot with just a short saying. Okay, so we're going into Proverbs painting wisdom as a person. And it directs us into that chokmah. Remember, we talked last week about chokmah being that skilled, crafted person who gets skilled and an expert in their craft, an expert whether it's someone who's in art or someone who's in mechanics, whatever else. This is becoming skilled in wisdom. And so the way we do that, when we make good and wise decisions, we're being guided by wisdom, or chokmah in this case. And so if we refuse to listen, it's real clear. You listen, you become wise. You refuse to listen, you become fools. There is no gray area. This is one of those where it's real simple. You either go to jail, do not pass go, do not collect $200, or you go around and you keep going around the board there. You follow God and His path for your life. So Lady Wisdom is calling out, making herself available to anybody who wants to listen to her. Anyone can access wisdom to make a beautiful and full life for themselves. It's available to anybody, whosoever will. She's crying out in the streets, how long will you simple ones remain simple? If we wanted to use modern vernacular to be blunt, how long are you stupid people going to stay stupid? You don't have to stay stupid. That's kind of bluntly what they're saying. Yes, you may be that, but you don't have to be that. You don't have to stay simple without the wisdom. And so we know that in the Proverbs, it's personified as a woman calling out in the streets, asking whosoever will. Now there's another lady trying to seduce, and she's trying to pull us to God. And we see the personification in the New Testament as Jesus Himself. 1 Corinthians 1:30 says, God has united you with Christ Jesus for our benefit. God made Him to be wisdom itself. Christ made us right with God. Also made Him our righteousness, which we're talking about in Galatians, right? Made us pure and holy, and He freed us from sin. That's a lot of good stuff right there that Jesus did, but He's the personifications of wisdom for us now. So we're going to touch on some main points on Proverbs and move on. We're just going to stick and jab and go. So main points, fear of the Lord. So the fear of the Lord, to have chokmah, we need to develop the fear of the Lord. To have that highly developed sense of living a godly life with wisdom, be skilled at wisdom, we must have the fear of the Lord. And the fear of the Lord is the foundation of true knowledge in Proverbs 1:7. But fools despise wisdom and discipline. Of course, we see there an antithetical parallelism, if you've been keeping up the last few weeks, right? Proverbs 9:10, the fear of the Lord is the foundation of wisdom. Knowledge of the Holy One results in good judgment. Synonymous parallelism. It builds on the previous thought. Okay, that's the last time I'm going to mention that, so hopefully you got that. So the fear of the Lord is the most important part and the beginning point. 18 references to the fear of the Lord in Proverbs alone, 50 throughout the Bible. So like almost 40% of all the references are in Proverbs about wisdom. The fear of the Lord is not trembling and cowering fear like this. It is a kind of a reverential awe that produces a humble submission to a loving God. Okay? It's a healthy respect for God's definition of good and evil, not yours. The thing about the current culture we live in is the audacity they have to say that God doesn't know what he's talking about. We'll define our own belief about what is good and evil. And I'm not talking about the world. I never get shocked when sinners act sinful. The church, though, is starting to act just the same and thinking they can define what's good and evil outside of God's counsel. And that's foolishness. Or in Ecclesiastes, you get there, it'll be kind of vanity too. So it means to revere and respect. We think about the relationship of a child with a parent. If the parent is raising the children in the fear and admonition of the Lord, but they're also a good parent with a good heart, that kid's going to respect them, and if they're right, they're also going to discipline them. We grew up in a day and age, my kids are all teenagers now, but they crossed the line. We even did what Proverbs said, and we applied a spanking to their backside. Never hit them anywhere but the backside and the hand. You don't do it, that is up to you. But what I did do is make sure they had discipline guidelines. Just not let them go. Talk about, if you think about like water with boundaries is a river, and it guides and directs, and there's life. Water without boundaries is a swamp, and stuff flows in but nothing flows out. It's stagnant, stale, and has no good outflow of life to it. And so when we have kids, we're kind of giving them that structure. And this is kind of a side note to Proverbs because it's in there a lot. Discipline your kids. But if you do it right, then they'll grow up fearing. They may fear something like getting grounded or getting something happening, But as they get older, if you've proven true on what you say and they know that you have their best interest at heart, they're going to start respecting you, what you say, because of the relationship. And they're going to be like, if Dad's saying that this is dangerous, don't do it, I'm going to listen to him. And that's a reverential kind of fear. So you see the difference. And that's kind of like we first get saved. We don't understand a lot of this, but we're going to trust God. We don't want to go to hell. We've been saved from hell. We're happy. But then we want to get past just fire insurance and get to that relationship. And we start to realize, boy, he loves me so much. And it's more than just salvation. And getting to know God and getting to know more of his attributes, experience it. Every time we get in prayer and get in the Word, we experience more of him and realize how much he does love us and have his best interest is our best interest. He literally created us for a purpose, and he's designed us for a purpose, and now he's teaching us how to walk that out. To get there, we have to have the fear of the Lord. It's basically... true wisdom is knowing those boundary lines, crossing them, and obeying even and especially when you don't understand or agree. The test of obedience does not come until you disagree. Think about that. We all think, well, I've been obedient. I'm doing this. It's easy to be obedient when you agree with what you're obeying. But what happens when you're wanting to go this way and God's wanting to go this way, and that's the test? Or what happens when God says to go this way and it looks crazy? The fear of the Lord comes in there and says, I don't understand, but I'm going to trust you. I hope you hold me as I step here, Lord, because I don't see anything to keep me up. Let's look at the fear of the Lord here in Abraham's life, okay? Genesis 22:12. Abraham had been told to kill his son Isaac, who was born of a miracle, right? And we know in Hebrews, he believed that as he's killing him, that God would resurrect him. So this was all in faith. But listen to this. Don't lay a hand on a boy, the angel said. Don't hurt him in any way, for now I know that you truly fear God. You've not withheld from me even your son, your only son. Side note, he's in covenant with God at this point in time. The fact that he was willing to give a son that was a miraculous birth, sacrifice him, allowed God and opened God's door to bring his son in the world to be sacrificed for us. That's just a side note. That's a pretty awesome moment in Scripture anyway. But the fear of the Lord will also guard you from evil. Proverbs 16:6. Unfailing love and faithfulness make atonement of sin. By fearing the Lord, people avoid evil. All who fear the Lord hate evil. Therefore, I hate pride and arrogance. I'm going to move here pretty fast. So, just to encapsulate down to this, fearing the Lord will bring a hatred for evil or anything outside of God's counsel and God's will. Things you used to watch and were comfortable with are going to start bothering you. You're going to feel that little scratching on inside, like, boy, I used to watch this, but boy, now I feel dirty the more I watch it. Or you're going to listen to God and you're praying and God says to do such and such or don't do such and such. And you're like, well, that makes no sense. And God may say, well, this may be good, but it's not God. What are you going to pick? Just because it's not a sin doesn't mean it's okay for you. And you got to get to the point where you realize that your life is no longer your business. It is not my business what God wants to do with my life because I gave it to Him. And why is that okay? Because I trust Him and I know His character and He has a better plan for me than I could have for myself. It doesn't mean I'm a mindless robot, but it does mean I'm surrendered to Him, and at the nudge of Him, I'm going to move. That's the fear of the Lord. Okay, another theme in there is the diligent person versus the lazy person. If you read the book of Proverbs, you know that Proverbs is not very favorable to lazy people. Let's see here. Take a lesson from the ants, you lazy bones. Learn from their ways and become wise. They have no prince or governor or ruler to make them work. They labor hard all summer, gathering food for the winter. But you lazy bones, how long will you sleep? When will you wake up? A little extra sleep, a little more slumber, a little folding of the hands to rest. Then poverty will pounce on you like a bandit. Scarcity will attack you like an armed robber. Believers should be the best and hardest workers around. Work is a part of life. It doesn't go away even at the end of this life. Revelation 22:3. This is when, after God's come back, after the millennial reign, after the new heavens and new earth. In other words, we're set on how we're going to live for eternity. Revelation 22:3. No longer will there be any curse. The throne of God and of the Lamb will be in the city, and His servants will serve Him. Work. It's not a bad thing. By the sweat of the brow is the bad thing there. But what's the first thing that God told Adam, who's in a perfect garden, sinless? Tend to the garden. Go work it. Work's a gift, not a curse. So, Proverbs talks about looking at that in that way instead of looking at, some people work harder to get out of work than to actually work. And now I'm telling you, as someone, when I go to get a project and I have someone who is lazy, I would rather they not show up, because it's more work for me to say, okay, go do this now. Oh, there goes sitting down there. Okay, and try to find them something to do. Proverbs 12:27, the lazy do not roast any game, the diligent feed on riches of the hunt. The sluggard buries his hands in the dish, will not even bring it back to his mouth. We know these people. We know these people. We've met these people. Just don't be those people. The sluggard says there's a lion outside, I'll be killed in public square. Why? He doesn't want to go outside. I like what Billy Sunday said. He said an excuse is the skin of a reason stuffed with a lie. Lazy people have all kinds of excuses why they can't do such and such. Again, excuse is the skin of a reason stuffed in a lie. It's very true. Okay. As a door turns on its hinges, so a sluggard turns on his bed. Proverbs 26:14. And I'm not talking about the occasional sleep-in day when you've been working hard 6 days or something like that. You know what we're talking about, though. They've been up all night playing video games and now they're sleeping all day type of thing. Okay. I'm not talking about, I had some family members that used to joke around that the closest they get to exercise was 1, 2, 3, 4, 1, 2, 3, 4, you know. Okay. Moving on, wholesome mouth versus polluted mouth. The Proverbs has a lot to say about the mouth. In Proverbs 6, it talks about the 7 things the Lord hates, and it goes 6 things the Lord hates, 7 are detestable to Him, in verse 16. Verse 17, haughty eyes, a lying tongue, so that's the mouth. Heart that devises wicked schemes, feet that are quick to rush into evil, a false witness who pours out lies, once again the tongue, a person who stirs up conflict in the community. That's hard to do without words. 3 of the 7 were things with our mouth. And if God hates them, that's a cheat code to say, don't ever do those. It's a pretty clear thing. If God hates them, have nothing to do with those. If nothing else, for the fear of the Lord, you're employing 2 things at once. Okay? Proverbs 26:11 in New King James Version. I love that one. A word fitly spoken is like apples of gold in settings of silver. 18:21, life, the tongue can bring death or life. Those who love to talk will reap the consequences, good or bad. Words can affect emotions. Words can affect relations, and they have a huge effect in every area of our life. Okay, so then, all right, we're going to move on from there. I like to summarize it, just saying, you've probably heard this poem. Dear Lord, so far I've done all right. I haven't gossiped. I haven't lost my temper. I haven't been greedy, grumpy, nasty, selfish, or overindulgent. I'm really glad about that. But in a few moments, God, I'm going to get out of bed, and from then on, I'm going to need a lot more help. So, the sayings or the hokum is applied to all aspects of life to provide guidance, to find a path for success. So that when we get out of bed, we can still have that success, right? If you design your life by these sayings, life is going to be good in all probability. Now, we know from the book of Job there are outliers. We'll also see in Ecclesiastes there are cynical outlooks on things. But overall, generally speaking, I like the saying, this old lady who had her Bible, and she had T, and then she had TP, over all these verses, and they're like, what does that mean? This guy was asking her, she goes, well, T means tried, TP means tried and proven. Book of Proverbs, there are many verses where I have tried and proven them in my life. They are legitimate, and they are powerful. And you lay your life according to those statutes, wisdom does follow, but not only that, God's hand of blessing follows even when you don't understand why. God will make you a success, and despite of yourself, even when you made 10 mistakes, He'll kind of come back and get you back on the right path if you start listening to wisdom. It's a relationship. It's not a list of do's and don'ts. You're responding to wisdom as a person, not as a checklist. Okay? All right, so Solomon's life itself, if you know Solomon's life, he didn't live such a good life. He didn't practice what he preached all the time. Solomon collected proverbs, but he didn't always live those proverbs. Solomon's life should be a warning to be doers of the word and not hearers only. Seems simple, and we also see that sometimes bad things happen to good people, and sometimes fools get rewarded. We're going to look at that in Ecclesiastes, and we're getting ready to go. But overall, Proverbs gives you the probabilities of having a successful life in your walk with God. Now, your version of success and God's version of success may be two different things, but you're going to find that when you have His success, you wouldn't trade it for your version. Okay, let's look at Ecclesiastes. So, I don't know if anybody's ever seen that movie Benjamin Button. I thought it was kind of silly. It wasn't like I wouldn't have gave it 5 stars, but I did watch it. And it's, if you don't know the story, the guy is basically born an old man and goes backwards in life. And then he's, and I'm thinking, well, I wouldn't want to keep going all the way back to a baby, but boy, it would be really nice if I was born old and I got to live that experience, and then by the time I had all that wisdom of age, I was in my teen years where I had all that energy and vigor. That'd be awesome, wouldn't it? But the opposite's true, and so Ecclesiastes kind of looks at all these things and all these of how to treat your youth, and it examines the question. May not answer it too well. The New Testament does a much better job answering the question of, why am I here? What on earth am I here for? What is the purpose in life? I love that line in Forrest Gump where he goes, "What is your sole purpose in life?" And he's like, "To do whatever you tell me, drill sergeant." I'm like, that is wisdom for that moment. But the Bible is very current and relevant. And the book of Ecclesiastes is asked this question, and it's very, very vulnerably dealt with. In other words, it's not just, how you know as a Christian, you're guilty of guarding your answers and putting on your projected image. We have a real image, but when we put our projected image out, what we want people to see. My wife and I can talk about, we sit there and we had a crazy morning imagine having 4 kids from 3 of the 4 are toddlers, and the one that's not is like 5 years old. Getting them all ready for church Sunday morning, getting them all fed, getting them all dressed, changing them again because they had an accident, going through all, why did you write on your sister? All this stuff, right? arguing in the car, going through there and getting in there, and then you open the church door. Praise the Lord, how are you doing? I know we're probably the only ones that ever done that. Yeah, we all know what I'm talking about because we've all been there in some way, shape, or form. Projected image. Ecclesiastes has nothing to do with any of that. It scales it down. And so Ecclesiastes, it's one of the 5 scrolls they read it's called the Megillah. And basically they had Song of Solomon, Ecclesiastes, Ruth, Esther, and Lamentations. They read at different festivals throughout the year, and this was read at the Feast of Tabernacles. And I'll talk a little bit more about that as we get to the end there. But the outline of this is Solomon starts with Solomon searching, and it's chapters 1 through 4, where he looks to find answers. Solomon has his sayings, some wise and some not so much. The book of Proverbs, there are wise sayings. The book of Ecclesiastes, And then Solomon's solution is in chapter 11 and 12. So it starts out in verse 1:1. It says, the words of the teacher, the son of David, the king in Jerusalem. Some people debate whether or not that's Solomon. That pretty well narrows it down. He's the teacher, the son of David, and the king. There was one son of David who was the king in Jerusalem. That would have been Solomon. But regardless of whether or not it is, it's basically his collective sayings. But another word for this is called the preacher. Actually, the book of Ecclesiastes, some people call it the preacher. But basically it means ecclesia is a gathering of people. Like you call the church ecclesia because it's a gathering of people. And so ecclesiastic is basically a teacher who's gathering people to learn. And that's what this is about. And so this is interesting because you're looking at this, and just like Psalms, you see some of those precatory Psalms where they're basically breaking off, telling God to destroy their enemies and things that are unbiblical, but yet they're wrestling with God, and by the end of those Psalms, they're usually getting more resolution in line with God and in agreement with God and closer to God and no longer cursing their enemies, right? In other words, it's real. And so looking at this, Solomon, now if you know the story of Solomon, he starts off asking for wisdom, and we talked about his origins, very commendable. Then he goes on to have 700 wives, 300 concubines. Concubines are technically a wife, but they're only wives for sexual purposes. 1,000. The dude was a dog. What else would you call that? Later in life, and it talked about these women were from different areas, and they started pulling him in different directions with their different religions. And so what we see in Ecclesiastes is actually the preacher is one who gathers and collects, and in this he has a collection of philosophies and ideologies about life that come from other viewpoints. Because what you'll see unique to Ecclesiastes, a lot of times he's talking about things that are vain and all this. He's looking from a lens of someone who's not looking to God. And so you're seeing the vanity of worldly wisdom in Ecclesiastes. And so this is an account of the searcher, the ultimate searcher going on his ultimate search. Does that make sense? And so he starts out in verse 2 saying something you're going to hear a lot. Meaningless, meaningless. Or you might hear the word vanity, vanity. Says the teacher, utterly meaningless. Everything is meaningless. That word in the Greek means like air, vapor, mist. Or if you want to think about soap bubbles. Looks like something's there, and then all of a sudden, poof, there's nothing to them. Okay? So think of soap bubbles whenever I say meaningless or vanity. So verse 3, what do people gain from all their labors at which they toil under the sun? These verses sum up Solomon's thinking at this point in his life. In Song of Solomon, we're going to get to next, he is much younger in there, and we're going to talk about that outlook. But this is older, jilted Solomon, who's just about to miss heaven if he doesn't get his act together. And so he's basically like the old Rolling Stone song, I can't get no satisfaction. If you're younger, forgive me, I just have these colloquial references that are my age, but I know what I mean. But he's describing emptiness to the uttermost. Not just empty, but totally empty and depraved is how he's coming across here. Nothing in this life satisfies, and that part's truth. Because what does he say? He uses another term called under the sun. He's looking at everything on this earth, on this temporal plane, and nothing in this material world can satisfy. That's truth. Because who's left out of the equation? God. And so he's looking at the vanity of navigating life. And so, in that earth material realm, verse 4, it says, generations come and generation goes, but the earth remains forever. Kind of like, I'm going to date myself a lot today. Crocodile Dundee. Lady's asking, what do you think about the Aborigines, the people claim to the land? And he says, they don't claim it, they really just belong to it. Said, see those mountains over there? They've been here for years and years. They'll be here long after we're gone. No use arguing over who owns them. It'd be like two fleas arguing over who owns the dog. In other words, meaningless. You're here, you're gone. Right? The cycle of birth and death, what's the point? He's basically saying. Verse 5 and 6, sun rises, sets, hurries back where it rises. The wind blows in south, turns north and round, goes over, returning to its course. The nice thing he does mention, life is not haphazard, there is predictability. Verse 7, all streams flow in the sea is never full, the place streams return again. But then he goes, what's the point? All things are wearisome, and I'm going to just kind of move through this a little faster. Solomon's correct in his observations, but his conclusions are not correct. Again, we have the lens of the New Testament. He does not. True? We can see that Jesus is the answer to all these questions. We see in Romans 8 where all creation is groaning up until this point. What changed? Jesus. So stuff that's temporal will never satisfy. And the thing is, in verse 17 he says, I apply myself to the understanding of wisdom and also of madness and folly, and I learned that this too is a chasing after the wind. But why? His gaze is inward and not upward. How are we doing? Okay. So what happened is you have the richest, most powerful man in the world who has no war, no problems, and he's depressed. Money can't buy you love, and it can't buy you happiness, and he had all, and he's depraved and depressed. Chapter 2 is that he starts to go on this journey to try anything to fill that hole inside of him. So in chapter 2 he tries pleasure. He has all the time in the world and all the money in the world. He's not busy fighting wars, and he's got so much money that he doesn't even bother counting silver. It's as common as dirt. And he goes on to live it up. He has fine wines, parties at his house. And he says, verse 17, so I hated life because the work that's done under the sun is grievous, all is meaningless. So he went through all this work. Sorry, I skipped a step. He went through the parties, then he went through business ventures, and he went through different things trying to build up and all these projects, and everything was the same result. Soap bubbles. Emptiness does not. Now here's something to realize in life, and you guys are in different stages of your walk in life. Not with God, but in your life. But think about this. If you were not saved when you were young and the older you got, think about your life. That hole inside of you didn't get smaller. It got bigger the longer you live without God. It truly does. It just gets bigger and bigger. Imagine him going through this and trying everything to fill it. He's trying to fill it with everything, and it just makes it bigger and bigger. And so the whole point of this, he samples in areas of science, philosophy, partying, and he comes out flat, incipient, and tasteless. Basically, it's like someone who says, yeah, the wine has no more taste anymore, the rich food doesn't have flavor anymore. He's depressed. And so he goes on through there in chapter 3. Solomon lists 28 various activities. We're going to come back to that. That's the first verses I read when we started this wisdom literature, and we'll come back to that. But God, we see in verse 14 and 15 of chapter 3 for the first time that God's inserted. And with God inserted, we get a little glimmer of light, and he brings God into the equation, and his outlook changed. Just like we talked about in Psalms, we talked about what the psalmists were complaining about, how the wicked prosper. And then I went to the house of God and I spent time with God and the godly, and my whole outlook changed because I realized what their end was. When you insert God in a situation, yours goes from vertical to horizontal, and your outlook goes from temporal to eternal, and things change dramatically. And you have the world's view is enjoy it now and do your best, but God's view is He's come to give you life more abundantly through Jesus. And we're going to stop there and finish up.